So welcome everyone to our session, Fulfilling the Promise of the UN75 Declaration. This is a partnership between UN 2020, Together First, the group of women leaders, the Club de Madrid, and the elders. By way of introduction, my name is Ilona Szabo. I'm the co-founder and president of the Igarapé Institute. We are a global think and do tank, founded in 2011, and committed to delivering evidence-based solutions on issues related to public, digital, and climate security. At the outset, I'd like to thank the organizer for inviting me to moderate such an important discussion on the future of global cooperation with this incredibly remarkable panel of speakers. Throughout 2019 and 2020, the United Nations carried out a global listening exercise on the occasion of the organization's 75th anniversary, to better understand people's hopes and fears for the future. In what has been called the biggest consultation in history, the UN75 team engaged over 1.5 million people in every single UN member and observer state, conducted more than 1,000 dialogues in 82 countries, independent polling and artificial intelligence analysis, and social and traditional media as well in 70 countries. Research mappings also in all regions. So the results of this listening exercise were summarized in the UN 75 report released in September 2020 and highlighted the overwhelming support for international cooperation, which is really good news. Also, unity in perceptions of the UN from all corners of the world, and the clear recognition that climate change is the biggest global long-term challenge, even in the midst of the pandemics. At the same time, the declaration on the commemoration of the 75th anniversary of the United Nations that member states adopted on September 21st, 2020, recognized that global challenges such as the COVID-19 pandemic and climate change, as well as the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals in the Decade of Action, are interconnected and can only be addressed through reinvigorated multilateralism. This is a forward-looking document that outlines the future we want and the UN that we need. The declaration sets out 12 commitments, from protecting our planet to being better prepared for the future crisis and achieving gender equality. The declaration requests that the UN Secretary General report back before the end of the 75th session of the General Assembly with concrete recommendations to advance our common agenda and to respond to current and future challenges. So in order to generate bold and actionable recommendations, the Executive Office of the Secretary General has assembled a team and organized a process to accelerate action. Together with the UN Foundation, the Igarapé Institute is helping the Secretary General's office move forward this process. So to help set the scene for our reflections today, and before we embark on a reflection on how we can harvest the results of the consultations and the declaration for a reinvigorated multilateralism, I have the pleasure now to invite Michèle Griffin, Senior Policy Advisor from the Executive Office of the Secretary General, to provide an overview of the Secretary General's Common Agenda process. Please, Michèle, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Ilona, and hello, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever your time zone. Thank you to the organizers for bringing us all together. And I'm delighted to be on such a distinguished panel, or at least adjacent to such a distinguished panel. As Ilona already mentioned, the SG has been given a mandate in the UN75 Declaration to come back to member states in September 2021 before the end of the 75th GA session with recommendations to advance our common agenda and to respond to current and future challenges. Obviously, in undertaking this mandate, he is guided in the first instance by the UN75 Declaration and the 12 commitments that member states made in that declaration. And I'm happy today to be with you to share some of the thinking about how he will fulfill that mandate. First, I think a couple of reflections on the context in which he is doing so. It's obviously inescapable that we're doing this in the middle of the COVID pandemic. We're coming up on 2 million deaths worldwide from that pandemic. And obviously it has exposed enormous gaps and inequalities and fragilities around the world. It has set us back decades on poverty eradication, women's rights, and many other goals. But it also takes place in the context of galloping climate change. And it's worth noting, I think, that water and air pollution alone will have killed 9 million people in the same period that COVID killed 2 million. And there are many other deadly killers out there: hunger, war, displacement, as well as risks that we have barely begun to foresee. So the context in which the SG fulfills this mandate is really one of a collective failure to foresee and prevent a set of existential threats to humanity and to the planet, compounded by a tragic lack of solidarity in the response to COVID in particular. And it's not that we didn't have roadmaps or agreements for how to tackle these challenges, or that we didn't really see them coming. And in fact, really, the experience has validated many of those roadmaps, such as the SDGs. And it's interesting to see that countries that had embraced the SDGs really did better in responding to COVID, as did countries with women leaders, as we've seen. So, you know, the SG has all of these experiences in mind as he attempts to respond to the mandate given to him by member states. And he has already shared a lot of his thinking on the kind of the world he as he sees it, and what he wants to pick up on in his report on our common agenda. And I in particular refer you to his speeches, his Mandela lecture last July, his New School speech on gender, and his recent speech at Columbia University on climate, because he sketches his thinking quite in depth in those speeches. And he points to a world in which the institutions that govern people's lives, whether at the global, national, or local level, are not delivering for people, or certainly are perceived not to be delivering for the vast majority of people, where the social contract is broken and need to be renewed, and the global economy and how we measure growth and think about progress is really leaving people behind. And he's called multiple times for a world that's more inclusive, fair, and sustainable, as well as one that takes the future more systematically into account. You know, there's a big intergenerational justice element to this. We can't bequeath future generations enormous debt and a broken planet. So what does he conclude from all of this? Obviously that multilateralism as a major part of the solution needs to be reinforced and reimagined. That's obviously completely consistent with the message we've heard from the global listening exercise conducted by the UN75 phase of this process. Member states have, as we've said, highlighted 12 commitments already in their declaration. And a simple way to think about that, frankly, is that they have laid out the what we need to do, and the SG is now asked to recommend how we get there, especially on areas where we've known what we need to do for a long time and yet still are not delivering. And obviously beyond those 12 existing commitments and themes, we need to be ready for a world where risks threaten to overwhelm us that we haven't even yet begun to foresee, and at a pace that is faster than any time in history. So let me give you a super quick snapshot of the proposed process. Essentially, building on the findings of the UN75 listening exercise, the SG imagines a process along 4 tracks. Obviously, first, member states, engaging with member states and closely consulting with them along the way. We've also reached out to a diverse group of thought leaders and luminaries around the world, inviting their thinking for solutions in the 12 areas. We've convened a group of young thinkers and asked them to work together on a paper that articulates how young people feel about the challenges before us and the future they want. And finally, there's a track that we're calling We the Peoples, which recognizes that civil society, cities, parliamentarians, and many other actors are indispensable partners in international cooperation today, and that we want to reach out to those partners, including all of you, in the process of preparing this report. Building on the UN75 consultations, but really focusing in this phase on solutions, on refining priorities and recommendations. And we will be doing that in close partnership with Igarapé, with the UN Foundation, with Accord, the National University of Singapore, and Southern Voice, who are some of our key partners in this process. I should say before I conclude that the report in September will really be the beginning of a process, not the end. The SG hopes for a kind of a reset of multilateralism that may take quite some time to bring about, and the report hopefully will manage to shift the needle and generate collective action and collective will towards that end. In the meantime, however, we have a year before us in which the best way to make the case for effective multilateralism is frankly to show it in action. And whether that's on the COVID vaccine and making sure that it's distributed according to need and not wealth, or in COVID recovery and making sure that we don't go back to the status quo, but rather recover in a way that leads towards a more equal and sustainable world, and one that is less vulnerable to the pandemic we've just been through, or on climate, where it is an important year to raise ambition on carbon neutrality in the lead up to the COP. And interestingly, all three of these near-term urgent priorities rest on mobilizing a broad coalition of actors: states, companies, cities, civil society, individuals. And so they really are essentially going to point us towards the kind of inclusive, effective multilateralism that the SG has been calling for. I will close here, looking forward to hearing all of your ideas, and especially to the thoughts of our very distinguished panel. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Michèle. The Igarapé Institute is very pleased to participate of our common agenda and looking forward for the next steps. So please allow me to introduce a panel that will for sure have incredibly useful insights as we embark into this process. We are extremely lucky to have with us Mary Robinson, former President of Ireland, former UN High Commissioner for Human Rights and Chair of the Elders; Danilo Turk, President of Slovenia from 2007 to 2012, and President of the World Leadership Alliance at Club de Madrid; Maria Fernanda Espinosa, President of the 73rd session of the UN General Assembly, former Minister of Foreign Affairs and Minister of Defense of Ecuador, and member of the Group of Women Leaders for Change and Inclusion; and Chebbi, the African Union's Youth Envoy. Thank you, each of you, for agreeing to share your reflections here today. I'm sure we have a fascinating discussion and hopefully oriented towards solutions. So this is so much needed. So let's get started. We'll be taking questions from our listeners as well. So please submit them through the Q&A box on your screen. I'll keep track of those questions and direct them to the speakers after the first set of discussions. So I would just pose a general opening questions, which is the COVID-19 pandemic has provided an opportunity to potentially reset global cooperation. The UN75 consultations have shown that there is an appetite for transformative change. So given the 12 commitments of the declaration, what are the most urgent change we should be pushing for? And what are the key priorities for systemic change in a post-COVID-19 world? So I would invite Mary just to start just leading us into this panel.
Thank you, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I'm very glad indeed to be on this panel to respond on these very critical issues and indeed to support the call of the UN Secretary General. As we know, the COVID-19 pandemic has provided an opportunity, as it has swept through every part of the world since the start of 2020, leaving a devastating cost. First and foremost in human lives, but also in terms of economic growth, political momentum, and social inequality. The pandemic has highlighted the deeply interconnected nature of our world and has made starkly visible the extent to which our own security is wholly dependent on the security of others, the fragility and humanity of our world. The pandemic has also exposed many of the underlying inequalities, both within and between countries. I hope that this will provide the impetus to seriously tackle the long-term drivers of such inequality in the coming years, including racial and gender discrimination, violence against women, the legacy of colonialism, inadequate social security nets and workers' rights, and chronic indebtedness across many countries in the global south, made worse by COVID. Multilateral cooperation between states is more important than ever, as the Secretary General has said, and it's the only way to effectively tackle the pandemic and the key global challenges that the world will face in its aftermath, such as the climate crisis and the new threat of a new nuclear arms race developing. I hope that the aftermath of the pandemic can provide opportunities for countries to fundamentally rethink their approach to tackling the climate crisis and to make the systemic changes that will be needed to meet the scale of that crisis. It's more urgent than it was last January or the January before, and yet we're preoccupied by COVID. It's critical that the countries make clear commitments to build back greener from the pandemic and ensure that economic recovery packages are developed in ways that are compatible with their pledges to combat climate change. All countries need to make bold and ambitious climate pledges ahead of COP26 in November. It's also critical that the nuclear states take seriously their responsibilities to pursue disarmament. The upcoming inauguration of President-elect Biden on the 20th of January, followed by the entry into force of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons 2 days later, presents hopeful opportunities to reinvigorate global support for nuclear non-proliferation and disarmament in 2021. However, it's critical that the P5 countries make tangible progress towards strengthening arms control agreements and reducing nuclear risks ahead of the Non-Proliferation Treaty NPT Review Conference in August. The first step must be an agreement between the United States and Russia to extend New START until 2026. And I'm glad to see the Biden administration and indeed Russia seem prepared to move in that direction. I've also been deeply alarmed and disturbed by the recent events in the United States with the storming of the US Capitol by pro-Trump extremists last week and the coordinated efforts by the President of the United States and a large number of elected politicians to illegally overturn the results of the presidential election. The elders, in fact, released a statement in early November after the election calling on President Trump to accept the results of the election. And we'll continue to speak out in support of peaceful transitions of power and respect for democratic values around the world. The recent events in the United States have highlighted more than ever the fragility of our democratic institutions, and the international community must make the upholding of democratic values and human rights an urgent priority in the years ahead. And I look in particular, Aya, to young people to help us to support that cause. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your thoughtful remarks, Mary. I would just like to invite also Danilo to share your insights with us, please. You're muted, Danilo. Please just, if you could open your microphone.
Mute. All right. Thank you very much, Ilona. And let me say that I'm very happy and very grateful for having been invited to this panel so early in 2021. Which is going to be a difficult year, but also a very important year for the world to deal with the most difficult problems of our time. Now, Mary Robinson has just explained to us a kind of a whole range of basic issues and the general way in which they should be addressed. And she gave us a very good list of tasks which are ahead of the United Nations and the international community as a whole. Now, I would like to focus my remarks on COVID-19 and the question of vaccines, which seems to be one of the early tests of the maturity of international community, of all the major players in the international community, and also a test of solidarity, something that is sadly and tragically lacking, as Michèle Griffin told us at the very outset of our meeting. I would like to refer all this to the UN Declaration at 75, which has an interesting structure. That declaration has put among the 12 priorities, as priority number 1, the statement that we will leave no one behind. This is innovative. This is not the way the United Nations has done that traditionally. And of course, it is a very demanding idea, leaving no one behind. And there is a reference to human rights in that first paragraph. And let us be reminded that list of human rights includes the right of everyone to the highest attainable standard of physical and mental health. This is what the UN has put at the center in the declaration as number 1 priority. But as we look around the world, we see that that priority is not being implemented properly, at least as far as the question of vaccines is concerned. Vaccine nationalism seems to be prevailing. The Secretary General has given a warning about that already. And this is exacerbating the divisions or the gap between rich and poor nations globally, but it's also increasing the differences within regions. I live in Slovenia, in a country in the European Union, and we can see a great deal of nationalism still around vaccines, irrespective of the fact that the European Union has tried to organize a collective action, and it will continue with that. But it's very difficult to overcome the nationalist sentiment which is there and which will have to be overcome in this year, a critical year for the vaccine. So what is essential here? I think the essential thing which we should not stop repeating is that the world needs a people's vaccine, not a profit vaccine. Profit must not be the first or the more important consideration here. Governments have already invested heavily in the production and the research and production, and there are international mechanisms which were established to provide something that would come close to the idea of the people's vaccine. COVAX as the main mechanism for that, the WHO's COVID-19 technology access pool, which provides the basis for sharing of knowledge and pooling resources globally. All these instruments have been established. Now they have to work, and there has to be political support for them to work properly. The key tasks in this domain are also very clear: preventing monopolies on vaccine, ensuring affordable prices, implementing fair allocation of vaccines, and ensuring true cost prices, so that vaccines could not be provided, but so that the vaccines could be provided by governments to people free of charge. Again, solidarity which would be necessary to full implementation of these tasks is lacking. And this leads to the question of leadership in this situation. How should that leadership look? What should constitute leadership? And I think that stronger political action at the global level through the G20 is needed. Now, G20 has established itself in the past 2 decades, past decade in particular, as a group of states that have assumed special responsibilities to deal with crisis situations. Now, crisis today is COVID crisis, which is an immediate one and which has to be addressed immediately. So G20 have special responsibilities, and I believe that the crisis that has to be handled can be handled through the mechanisms of World Health Organization and the United Nations if there is adequate leadership of the G20. And we should not tire of repeating that. These are the countries that can make a change, and they should do their utmost to achieve that. And then finally, there is another aspect which also has to be brought into the center of international attention, and it is not at the center of international attention now. The question of intellectual property rights relating to the vaccines. As many of us have noticed, South Africa and India have already proposed a patent waiver at the World Trade Organization to enable better management of production and distribution of vaccines. That's important. Although patent waiver per se is not a solution, it would be an important step towards solutions. It is not clear whether the initiative will succeed, but its message is clear. The message is that everything has to be done for the people's vaccine and not for the profit vaccines. Now, obviously, the existing system of international intellectual property protection does not work well in the context of pandemic. It is not a sacrosanct system. It can be reformed and it should be reformed. Vaccines are critical tests, not only for multilateral cooperation, but also for our common humanity. There is something very basic in law. You know, I'm a professor of law, essentially by profession. The principle of prioritizing life over profit is well established in all legal systems. It has to be established internationally as well. And here is where I see critical tasks for the future. And of course, I'll be happy to answer questions if there are any. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Danilo. You just touched an incredibly important point, and I'm sure we're going to be able to dig into the discussion a little bit more. So I'd like to invite Maria Fernanda to share her initial remarks as well.
Thank you so much, Ilona, and thank you all for this very powerful, energizing start of the year. Thank you to the coalition of the UN We Need and the partners represented today. And of course, greetings to my fellow panelists and the Office of the SG. Michèle Griffin is a delight to have her here. And I think that when I took the decision to start a process to commemorate the UN 75th anniversary, the idea was precisely to unleash a global conversation on the future of the UN, to involve we the peoples in shaping and imagining the UN we need. And I dreamt about using the opportunity for awareness raising, for touching the minds and souls of public opinion, of young people, and of course, to have an ambitious, meaningful political declaration to boost the commitment of member states to the principles of the UN Charter, to multilateralism, and to start a process for a profound retooling of the United Nations. And of course, at that time, we weren't even thinking about the COVID pandemic. And I have to say that the first person who was convinced, excited with the idea, was the Secretary General himself. He immediately appointed a team led by Fabrizio Hochschild, Natalie Sammersinger, and a team of outstanding and committed professionals. And today, I am so thrilled to see Michèle Griffin taking the torch and continuing the process. And the results that we have had, in spite of the turmoil, the losses, the suffering, the uncertainty created by the COVID-19 pandemic, I think are really, really promising. There are so many achievements that need to be underscored. It was already mentioned, we have a 12 action point, concise and powerful political declaration that of course requires strong leadership and political will to be implemented. And that touches, as was already mentioned, the critical questions of our time, such a profound UN reform in its three principal organs, the issue of inclusiveness, partnerships, participation, trust and efficiency, and a boost in the delivery and implementation capacity of the SDGs, the Paris Agreement, with a focus on, of course, addressing the crisis, the main crisis, which is the inequalities crisis, including women and girls, digital inclusion, sustainability, the health of our planet, and the promotion of peace and stability. And I think, it is so encouraging to see that 1.5 million participants have responded to the UN survey. 60,000 organizations were involved in the discussion. 900 million watch the UN 75 news and events. And this, I think, it shows how important multilateralism is, especially today. And I also have to acknowledge the extraordinary work of civil society in general, of the UN 2020 coalition and its extremely robust, comprehensive UN 75 People's Declaration and Plan for Action. I think the plan itself is a testimony that coalition building and partnerships are the best way to co-create, to build. It has been a show of strength, of wisdom, of co-responsibility. And if we look at the action plan, it is a list of truly actionable proposals that need to be taken very seriously. From immediate actions to long-term aspirations, from a stronger global health cooperation system. And I think President Turk and Mary were very clear about vaccine nationalism and our concern of access to the vaccine, to treatments, and how to stop the pandemic taking more lives, especially of the poorest. So I think that, stronger global cooperation system, more representative global governance, and a suggested UN Peacebuilding Council or similar ideas that Global Resilience Council. So there is a lot of solutions on the table. The question is what comes next. And I would say there are two converging, mutually reinforcing paths. And I would call the shell and the kernel of the same fruit that are inextricably linked. The shell, meaning, the institutional retooling of the UN, a well-funded UN, a well-functioning organization, including, of course, a built-in predictable civil society participation mechanism. And the kernel, it was, mentioned in such a thorough way by President Turk and Mary Robinson. The kernel is the agenda, the priorities, the platforms. This is the year to reconcile with nature, with strong, coherent outcomes of major COPs, climate, biodiversity, oceans, food systems, and of course, a very important moment, which is the Generation Equality Forum. These are key defining moments for the international agenda, and we need to ensure that we truly are in the decade for action. So both processes, the kernel and the shell should run in conjunction and be based in a sustained, participatory and open process under the leadership of the SG's office. I was very encouraged to hear Michèle, and of course of member states. And just to close, I would say that we have the responsibility to take advantage of this time of creativity, of reinvention, the political momentum that and the willingness to see transformation happen. And for that, of course, we need leadership, but not only of messianic leaders, not only the G20 heads of state and government, but a whole of society leadership and co-responsibility, where young people have a great role to play. So just to end, I would say that we need to collectively craft a new culture of multilateralism that is inclusive, that is networked, and that responds to the needs of the people and our planet, and that is accountable and delivers for all. So I would close my initial remarks with that, looking very much forward to working with you for this co-creation process. And thank you again.
Thank you very much, Maria Fernanda. Couldn't agree more. And I think it's perfect setting for Aya to share the views for the future. And all of this, I think, has to happen fast, because your generation deserves a better place to be. So please, Aya, share with us your remarks.
Thank you so much, Ilona, for having me, and hello to the over 270 people joining us here and those watching online. I see a lot of young people on the chat. I'm following the conversation and wishing all of us a better year in 2021. It's really an honor to be with leaders I admire. So tough to speak last. And the three of you are youth champions, so I feel very empowered here. To start my thread of thoughts, I think the pandemic showed us how no one is safe until everyone is safe. It showed us how global we really are, how interconnected. And today, global action and being a global community, I think it's not a choice anymore, it's a responsibility. But maybe we are more aware of this as millennials, because we always think of ourselves as interconnected. We think of our world as borderless. And yet many of our global leaders are not and fail to act. So if I am to focus on one of the 12 commitments of the declaration, it would be to remind all of us of the commitment to listen to and work with young people, which I think, in another word, saying talk to us, not about us. This commitment speaks to the rest of all the other commitments. If we commit to protect our planet, we have to listen and engage young people, because it's about our future. If we commit to promote peace and prevent conflicts, we have to listen and engage youth and not label youth as the radicalized into violent extremism, the armed rebel, but also recognize that young people are peace builders. And if we really commit to build trust, we need half of the world's population to trust and engage and transform our traditional institutions. If you want to beat a pandemic, we know now that you need the collaboration of young people. So for me, in all of the declaration commitment, we really need to recognize that young people are drivers, not subjects of development, and have a role to play in every aspect of our lives. And if we are really to achieve these commitments, we also need what I call intergenerational co-leadership. It's not about tomorrow and passing the torch. We need to be co-designers of the policies now and co-creators of solutions now, so we can take ownership of that future we want. And also always ask the question of why the youth need the attention of the world, why young people now, are important and rising. It's simply because we're the most youthful population in the world and in history. I mean, in Africa, only 65% of the population is under the age of 30. And it's expected to grow and count for 2 billion young people by 2050. So really leaving this unresolved will exacerbate tomorrow's challenges. We have the demographic power, we have the voting power, we have the mobilization power. Young people take to the streets when no one listens. We've seen the past decade, the youth protests and youth movements really change our country's political landscape. Starting from my country, Tunisia, we're actually celebrating tomorrow a decade of the revolution, the first 21st century youth-led revolution. And I mean, literally, it's been a decade of youth protest from Tunis to Lagos. So how many more revolutions we need to have our leaders listen to our demands? I think the other important commitment in the declaration I really need to highlight is the digital cooperation, safe, affordable digital access for all. This is really can solve issues of participation, of voice, of employment, and everything digital so far is really exclusive because the power of information is vastly unequal. Those disconnected can be invisible and out of the digital revolution. And most of those are the vulnerable, the refugee, displaced, the people with disability, women and girls, and so on and so forth. My office actually last year published a policy paper on youth agency and challenges and COVID-19 recovery roadmap, and they all agreed on one thing. I mean, it was a result of 54 consultation with 6,000 young people, and they all agreed that digital divide is real and it's unfair for the continent, especially for our continent. I mean, nearly half of the world is offline, and in Africa, 70% of our population is offline. So those of us who are really on this platform are the most privileged, and we have the responsibility to make a difference because we have this access. So if we talk about, maybe to conclude, if we talk about the future we want, President Turk said it's about people before profit. Absolutely agree. And I think it also has to be about freedom. Young people want to create livelihoods for themselves, not just acquire the skill, but the freedom, the space, the platform, the resources to use that skill. If we are empowered with digital skill without investing in digital infrastructure, without creating the enabling environment, without certifying youth innovations, we are not solving the problem. We are merely responding to a trend and to pandemic time. So trust young people to co-lead, put the technology in their hands to do magic, let them use their genius to innovate and disrupt and to help really the whole ecosystem flourish. And I think the question that remains is, are our leaders ready to deliver on this commitment? Because young people are.
Thank you so much, Aya. Very inspiring. So just let's get the discussion going. I'll just touch on one question to each panelist so we can open also for the public. So just to start with Mary. So you've called climate change a man-made problem with a feminist solution, which I completely agree. What are some of the women-led solutions that you've identified that the international community should pay attention to and should support them in scaling up?
Well, we've just listened to one young woman, Aya Chebbi. She is a first African Union Youth Envoy, and she's used her position and she's built, she's talked about young people, but actually young women are giving a lot of leadership. For example, on the climate movement. I'm talking about, Vanessa Nakate, Shea Bastida, Jamie Margolin, Greta Thunberg. They're all great leaders in their own right, and bringing thousands and indeed millions of young people with them. And then women, are at the heart of their communities, and they're very innovative sometimes. Ursula Rakova is moving her people from her Carteret Island to Papua New Guinea because they can't live anymore on her island. And she's gone and formed relationships, bought land, but she says very sadly that she has to leave the land of the bones of her ancestors. And that's unfortunately what will happen with this climate crisis. I wrote a book a little while ago on climate justice, 11 stories, and 9 of them were about what women were doing as leaders in, building resilience, leading in their community. There were also 2 good men, but essentially, I think if you look at what's happening in adaptation in particular, and increasingly in mitigation and in access to clean energy, it's women who are grouping. I'm part of a number. I'm part of Fearless Women, Connected Women, Dangerous Women, all different groupings. And we're starting a new African Europe linking of women leaders. And it's a way of doing. It's problem solving, practical, real in people's lives, and urgent.
Excellent. Count me in, Mary. So to Danilo, you touched on a very, very important issue of solidarity. Yet recently, we've been witnessing what the Secretary General calls the vaccine nationalism moving at this full speed. So where is the solidarity? How can we change this political equation?
Well, solidarity doesn't come automatically. Solidarity has to be nurtured, has to be developed. Now, you see, I'm very pleased to be part of the panel which has female majority. So I'm not complaining about gender imbalance here, although gender balance, I think, is always the ideal proportion. Our composition of the panel tells us a great deal about concern for solidarity, which women are generally very good in articulating, expressing, and fighting for. Women, in my experience in political work, are much more serious about solidarity, even if it doesn't produce results soon. And that's a very important quality. We also talked about young people. And again, I agree. I mean, you see, we didn't mention Greta Thunberg in our conversation about climate, but I mean, it's kind of a miracle what happened as a result of engagement of a single young person, a young female person in this case. And I believe that there can be many more situations where young people can take leadership in matters of climate, which of course is something that concerns them very strongly, and in other matters. Perhaps not so much in the case of vaccines, because that's immediate and will require really a very hard work at the political and diplomatic level. Here, the Secretary General will have a very important role to play to repeat tirelessly that solidarity is the order of the day today if the humankind is to survive. I mean, this is really very fundamental, and the articulation of solidarity, the immediate tasks belong to the Secretary General, to heads of state and government, to the political class, many of whom are women, and in Europe in particular, they are really very much in the lead already. And then on the slightly more longer term tasks, I think whatever young people are doing today is really essential. And I have mentioned the climate, of course, which is one area. Of course, there is this whole question of digitalization, the question of interconnectedness, the questions which have to do with technologies. I understand that there is a group called Global Pulse, which is organized in the realm of the United Nations, a kind of a broader kind of area of UN system. I mean, I would like many initiatives like this to flourish, and they will certainly change things. They will change the United Nations and help reform. So that's how I see the emergence of solidarity over time. And I'm not entirely pessimistic. The diagnosis that solidarity is not there, or at least is not adequate, should be only an invitation to do more on all these fronts to make it happen.
Thank you, Danilo. And Maria Fernanda, you mentioned how you started the UN anniversary process back in 2018. So what did you expect the process could achieve, and what has changed since then? Any new views?
Well, first of all, I think that, we weren't expecting the pandemic with the multiple effects that it has had. But that was a stress test for the multilateral system. And we have seen that we need, a fully empowered United Nations, a WHO that is fully funded, that is delivering as people expect. And of course, the all crisis, what happened with COVID is all crises, as Mary mentioned, were magnified because of the pandemic. We saw, inequalities in front of our eyes, who had access to treatment, who didn't, the people who died, the very difficult situation of women, of indigenous peoples. Ilona, and I know very well the impact of COVID in indigenous peoples in the Amazon region, for example, their complete lack of access to health services, the persons with disabilities, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it magnified the already existing crisis, climate change, the biodiversity extinction crisis. So I join President Turk in saying, yes, solidarity is something that is much more needed than ever. A strong, vital, retooled multilateral system is more needed than ever, but it is not going to happen, by natural generation. It has to come from a deliberate effort to strengthen a system that needs to deliver for all. And just looking at what is happening with the vaccines is extremely worrisome. This vaccine nationalism is happening as we speak. The very powerful and wealthy are buying everything, there is no price control, there are no protocols, there is no proper cooperation, solidarity that is taking place now and today. So there is a lot of work to do ahead of us. As I mentioned, we have to take this very painful context to really build back better, build back greener, build back more equal. And I think it really, there is a crying need for strong voices and leadership. And as I already mentioned, I mean, we don't need these messianic leaders, only, some heads of state and government that of course are needed. But there is a whole of society, co-responsibility. In listening to Aya, we know clearly that we need to co-create. I really love this intergenerational co-creation that Aya mentioned. We all have a role to play. And that was the idea with UN75, and this idea of the shell and the kernel, and the effort that we need to do collectively to make sure that we deliver on the UN75 Declaration, but also on all the proposals that are out there on the table and that need to be taken very seriously, because they were a process of co-creation from civil society in dialogue with member states. So I think that we do need strategy and tactics for what is going to happen from now on. And this year is a critical year for multilateralism, that is for sure. All these critical high-level summits, conferences of the parties. I am fully aware that conferences do not solve, the existing crisis, but they do help to position the agenda, to boost commitments, not only from member states, but also commitments from the private sector, commitments from civil society. So this intergenerational, multi-stakeholder
Thank you so much. And I think
it is much. I have to say, just to close that, this impressive process unleashed by the UN75, it means that there is appetite globally, to be engaged and in this co-creation process, not only of the world to make it more sustainable, but also of the institutions and the global institutions. And, in global governance, we know that the center is our United Nations, and we, the peoples, have the co-responsibility as well.
Thank you, Maria Fernanda. And you mentioned problems that were worsened with the pandemics. And then I would just like to ask Aya, who is the first youth envoy of African Union, but also a Pan-African feminist, a champion for gender equality. We know that the pandemic has worsened also the gender-based violence in many countries around the world, including in my own Brazil. How can we make gender equality a priority on this recovery plan, Aya?
Can you hear me? Because my internet is a bit unstable. Yeah?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, indeed, I think the pandemic has indeed worsened gender-based violence around the world. Women have been, forced to lock down at home with their abusers, with no possible access to assistance and legal protection. I was in Namibia last October following the protest of young people who were demanding the state of emergency on GBV. Because it really has hit an emergency. I think gender-based violence is also very much linked to economic impact. We can't control GBV if young women are not economically empowered and remain vulnerable, basically, to power dynamics to offer food and care to abuse them. So for me, I think, how do we have a gender lens in all of our future recovery plans is to have an intersectional lens with patriarchal structure, GBV, economic impact, and so on and so forth. It really has to be a part of the response and recovery pathways. And I think also, it was mentioned, especially on civil society, women organizations on the front line are really overwhelmed, and they lack the funds, the capacity, the support, and we need to resource them to be, to continue the important work that they do. And maybe when we define gender-based violence, we need to also define it as violence. To take it more seriously. Maybe that will then give us a platform to have a conversation or intersection of women, peace and security agenda, youth peace and security agenda, and resolutions. Maybe when we start talking about GBV as child marriage is violence, female genital mutilation is violence, girls dropping out of school because of their periods is violence. They're all forms of economic, sexual, domestic violence. Maybe then we can start taking gender-based violence more seriously. And I think also in the declaration, if we are really serious about transformative change, which is the core of the declaration when it starts, we need to deal with structural issues, structural violence, structural oppression, structural exploitation, patriarchy. We need to really address the root causes so our generation doesn't inherit the same issues. And gender inequality is among these problems we do not wish to inherit, and we wish to really end with us. And I wanted to maybe just a few thoughts following on what Maria Fernanda said on generational collaboration and co-leadership. I saw a lot in the chat, people asking, what does it mean, intergenerational? Why, people who are above 30 don't also, they're also innovative, they need our attention. And I think that's an important conversation because part of the generational gap and dichotomy is a lack of communication. If I take Africa as an example, we have the average age of African leaders is 64. In leadership, heads of state and government, and the average age of the population at 20. So those are 40 years of communication gap. We want maybe the same thing, but we're speaking different languages. And there is an assumption that, when your time comes, you will lead, when go through, the journey, get an internship, then get the job, then climb the ladder. But if we co-lead from now, if we understand these, especially intergovernmental, bureaucratic, slow failing systems, then we can change them, then we can digitalize them, then we can innovate within them. And I think that's part of why I challenged myself to go into the African Union as an intergovernmental organization. I come from activism. I was part of the revolution in my country. But for me to really be able to make transformative change and to start, all of us occupying these institutions, that's when we can co-lead. And I think that's a really important conversation happening in the chat that we need to continue. All the elders and the young people who are part of this conversation, we need that intergenerational conversation at all levels. At the municipal level, at the council level, at the UN, at the AU level, at the family level. We need the community, the indigenous, and I think the indigenous community may be a great example of that, of how the wisdom and innovation really come together, how young people take the wisdom from the elders and innovate in the communities and the strategies and how they are resilient. It's extremely important. I can't emphasize it enough, because if we really want to move with UN75, if we really want to move to recovery from COVID-19, we need every platform to become intergenerational.
I have very inspiring and powerful points. I would just kindly ask if the panel would mind if we take 10-15 extra minutes so we can just have at least 2 questions from the audience. Is that okay? If we continue a little bit further. So I'll take this as a yes. So I'll just share the first question, and I think who feels that would like to address. So please just go forward. How can we improve the democratic quality of political leaders after all they have the power to undermine or improve the democratic institutions? So it's about leadership. We've been speaking a lot. So who would like just to answer this first one? Mary, please.
I can come in a little just initially, and I hope others will come in. I think we've had a bad and bumpy time of populist leadership. And the worst example was President Trump. I think the very fact that has led to such utter worry about the fragility of the democratic process in the United States, and the possibility of armed groups coming to various capitals over the next few days between now and the inauguration, has really frightened people and brought us back to a real understanding that we have to defend democratic principles, and that we need to understand the importance of the rule of law and of concepts that we took too much for granted and didn't bother reinforcing. And so I think there are lessons that I think other populist leaders hopefully will be weakened by the somehow outing of the fact that Trump has been such a disastrous leader. That's all I would say.
Yeah, we hope. Please, Danilo.
Yes, what I would like to add, I fully agree with what Mary said. I just would like to add, for young people, this of course represents a particular question. How do young people in a country where there is a populist sentiment, and many times young people become victims of populist sentiment, an object of recruitment and so forth. How do young people react in this sort of circumstances? And what I think political leaders should make clear is that this is a moment, this is a time when critique of democracy and democratic practices is in order. Because I think that new quality of democratic politics can come only as a result of serious critique that young people will lead. This, I believe, is essential nowadays, because without critique of democratic practices and their deficiencies and their wrong directions, we are not going to be able to improve. Now, of course, young people are usually very good in developing the necessary critique. The important thing is that they are encouraged by political leaders that critique is welcome. And that, I think, is something we have to give much more thought to.
100%. Would you like to comment, I or Maria Fernanda? Maria Fernanda, please.
Well, sure. Basically, fully endorse what Mary and Danilo have stated, but I think that one of the issues that struck me looking at the numbers of last year's assessment is the increase in the lack of trust in institutions in general. And when you look at the list, the lowest is government, trust in government, trust in judicial systems, trust in parliaments. Just a Latino barometer, which is for Latin America and the Caribbean, I was trying to find these numbers, and the lack of trust in institutions was of 16% in 2010, and just increased to 28% in 2019. And with, the pandemic and everything, meaning that, there is no legitimacy and trust, especially of young people, in the political system. And I think that basically one of the responsibilities that we have is to fight indifference. To fight indifference. We cannot be indifferent. We have to engage, we have to participate, we have to have a voice. You see that there are some presidents that are elected with 30% of the votes of the overall national population. And this is really a source of concern. And when you see that parliaments have 20% of trust from people, there is a critical issue of trust there that we need to overcome. And Mary was very clear to say we have seen, a cascade of populist leaders that have damaged democratic institutions so much. But for that, I think the antidote is participate, have a voice, and fight indifference.
Moraya, how do you see this?
I see it from two lenses. The first is that we need to democratize information, because sometimes the view of the few becomes the narrative, while the majority narrative is not there, not because they're not speaking of it, but because they don't have access. And that's something, for example, in Tunisia, we democratize information, and we were blogging about what's happening. We transformed completely the way we use social media, because then everyone has a voice. Everyone is confident that I have a voice, I have a say in the system. And I think that's part of building a very, very strong civil society. In Tunisia, we won the 2014 Nobel Peace Prize. It wasn't for any politician, it was the quartet, the 4 strong civil society organization. And that was a testimony that civil society can be the watchdog, civil society can be that critical, critique that President Turk is talking about. Civil society then empowers every citizen to contribute to governance. And I think that's when we can shift systems, when we can shift decisions, when we can shift political discourse. And then the second lens I see it from is female leadership. I want to believe female leadership is collaborative, is emotionally intelligent. From New Zealand to Norway to Taiwan, we see that female leaders have handled the pandemic differently. There is no strong and solid and depth analysis of that, but I want to believe that there are traits of female leadership that are different from male leadership. And maybe if we have more female leaders, if we have younger leaders, maybe the world will change. Maybe we will have less war. Maybe we will have less gender-based violence. We have not seen that word yet. So I think we need to be able to close these gaps, this gender gap, this generation gap, put more young people into the system, more female leaders into the system, to see what other traits of leadership can we have. Because as far as I'm concerned, we are in an era lacking of role models. As much as we are very inspired by a lot of leaders in the world, but as role models, global role models to look up to as young people, we are very much seeing, as everyone said, a populist agenda, a nationalist agenda, me, and my own interest. And that's why whenever I'm on a platform like our 3 leaders here today, I'm so inspired, because then I'm like, okay, I can also be that leader. I can navigate those systems and still be true to my own, values. Because when we see that kind of leadership, we're like, okay, that's the distrust of young people to politics. We see politics as corrupt. And if I go into that, this is the kind of leader I become. So we need to see more of these role models who are in leadership in the global space, in the national space, who show us that you can still make change, you can still be your truthful values, you can still be progressive and transform those institutions from within.
Thank you so much, Aya. And I have to say, you are already a leader, so keep up. You know, a lot to come for you, but you are already. So just a final question from the audience, and we're getting to the end of our amazing panel here. Just I'll read one more, and who feels that would like us to share brief comments, please go ahead. So recognizing that global solidarity, shared planetary destiny, and oneness of humanity are the new first principles of this moment. If you were the SG, the Secretary General, what would be the next steps to advance these vital themes? Please, Mary, are you?
I was actually going to let somebody else jump in first.
Okay.
on this occasion, and I will.
Okay. Anybody would have any recommendations on how to advance global solidarity, shared planetary destiny, and oneness of humanity as principles?
I mean, for me, is really to make the word borderless. The more we meet, the more we engage, the more we sit on the same table, the more we will, you know, rise above our differences. This is a conversation we have a lot in Africa, especially in issues of conflict and peace and security. And we always, when we have conversation in the youth space, our message is always, let's rise above our ethnic, tribal, religious differences. Let's be first and foremost African. Let's build Pan-African solidarity. So for me, I think my generation think of the words as borderless, as interconnected, as think of our diversity as something that enrich us and advance us. And I think the more we see how interconnected we are, that my liberation is your liberation. You know, the Ubuntu in Africa, we say, you know, I am because of who you are. So the more we know that if I support in solidarity, Black Lives Matter, if they have their liberation, I have my liberation where I'm sitting. If, you know, climate is solved in Africa, then it's solved in Europe, then all these crises are solved. I think that is the perspective where we have to start having conversation, and we have to bring, if we really don't want young people to inherit systems that are failing, if we really don't want young people to be products of these systems currently, we need to start building those solidarity platforms for youth to be together, so they don't inherit that same system of like, you know, we're divided, where we have different ideologies. And what I do in my role is to create that Pan-African space for young people that, you know, whatever happens in Ghana affects Tunisia, whatever happens, you know, in Mozambique affects Morocco. So creating that, and many of the youth that we bring together, they meet for the first time. They've never known about each other culture, or, you know, and then they found out, you know, someone in Kenya speaking Swahili is the same in Tunisia and Arabic, and, you know, and all of that starts fading away all our differences. So it's becoming more human. It's human first. And I think that's where we have to really create those powerful communities, those resilient communities, and empower the next generation. For me, at least, my mission is to empower the next generation of Pan-Africanists, young people who see Africa as one and who work beyond, you know, our differences and our colonial legacy.
So I think I would just take us to the concluding question after like Aya's, I think, very, very inspiring ideas. So, and it's a hard one, in less than 60 seconds, if any of you would like to offer a specific solution that you think we could just implement right now to start moving the process of the Decade of Action forward. Please, Danilo.
All right. Well, Aya spoke about the ideal of a borderless world. The paradox is that borders have never been as sharp and solid as they are today because of COVID. And this is the time when leaders have to communicate imaginatively and differently. So the Secretary General could spend at least half of his every day on the phone or on video, talking to leaders in all parts of the world, as something that is quite normal in this kind of circumstances. As far as the immediate tasks or tasks that can be sufficiently specific are concerned, my suggestion would be, let us start thinking today about a global social summit, a World Social Summit, which would be a conclusion of the process starting with the UN at 75, but which will focus on the first priority, leaving no one behind. Something that should be really focused on the critical social issue of the world, and something that would include not only heads of state and government, but would find a formula for bringing together all these different actors of whom we have spoken today. Now, it is not too early to start thinking about something like that to happen in 3 years' time, and try to solve as many problems in the process as possible.
Thank you very much. Please, Mary.
I'd like to tackle a hard nut, and I'm not very optimistic, but I want to tackle the part of the UN that is letting down the UN constantly, and that is the Security Council. It is letting down the UN in its failure to act and its use of the veto. So I would like to see restraint on the veto. It's something that the elders actually have been working on. And we've kind of called for, we proposed that whenever a P5 state casts a veto in a mass atrocity situation, that state should be obligated to publicly explain their decision and suggest an alternative way forward to protect the populations that are under threat. That doesn't happen at the moment. They just veto. They're not asked to explain, and equally importantly, the remaining member states shouldn't give up, but should redouble their efforts to find a collective way forward. It is shocking what we're seeing, especially in Syria, where a total blockage, in Yemen, the loss of human life, and the kind of sense that the Security Council is becoming less and less effective. And of course, it needs to be more broadly reformed, but you were asking for, I think it could happen if the P5 want to restore confidence in the UN broadly and in the Security Council. They should insist on restraint in the use of the veto.
Thank you so much, Mary. Maria Espinosa, last remarks.
Well, I think that to start with, I think that I cannot agree more with Mary about the deadlock situation in very critical circumstances of the Security Council, and I think that should be, considered in this umbrella of the reform call in the UN75 Declaration of the 3 principal organs. I think that I would like to use perhaps 4 verbs. The number 1 is to resignify. I think that there is a much needed narrative of hope, of enthusiasm, of fighting indifference. In some, I think that we collectively need to reinvigorate the power of words, of our promises, and to understand that they do shape reality. When we write a declaration, they do shape reality, and they have to lead to action. And I think that the environment for transformation is the right one. The second verb would be to reconcile. And I think we have the opportunity to reconcile among humans, to really walk the talk on the disarmament agenda, for example, to reconcile among humans, but also to reconcile with nature, with our planet. And to reconcile economic recovery with the justice and environmental care. The third verb would be perhaps to restore, and to restore confidence and trust in institutions, in justice, in democracy. And I think that the reform of the UN architecture is extremely needed. And I think that now we have a mandate to do so. And the last verb perhaps would be to co-build or co-create a better world, more sustainable, more peaceful, more equal and more humane, and the way to do it is this multi-sectoral inclusive process that has been mentioned several times today. I think that strong global governance, solidarity and cooperation is an issue of self-interest, is an issue of survival. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maria Fernanda. Aya, last remarks.
Well, it's all been said. I think the Secretary General is well surrounded by youth, but maybe we can have more. He has parity in gender. Maybe we can have more of young people as well, and he can achieve that. So we can really achieve this intergenerational co-leadership we're talking about. And then I think the second thing is we need formal channels of civil society participation. In every structure, in every framework, in every conversation, there needs to be a seat for civil society. I think that will make more the UN, people driven. And lastly, let's let the UN shake things up. I think the UN needs to shake things up to make our member states implement. I don't think we lack policies. We have many progressive policies. When I came into the African Union, I was astonished with how much progressive policies we have. I think implementation now and action is the important to achieve. So I hope this is the year of implementation.
So thank you so much. All that remains is for me to thank you, speakers and participants, for being part of this incredibly important discussion to be continued, because we know it will take each and every one of us to change this game. So thank you again, stay safe, and let's continue this conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.